Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Going to discuss the recent report from the United Nations Security Council's Analytical Support and Sanctions and Monitoring Team. My co-host and editor, FDD's Long War Journal, as well as the senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation, that's Caleb Weiss. Caleb is here. We're going to discuss that report. Caleb, great to talk to you again.
Yeah, good to be back after a long hiatus.
Yeah, we've had a lot going on, a lot of coverage, obviously, of the war in the Middle East. Haven't had a lot of time to turn to the jihadism issues and the issues discussed in this report. And there's a lot to discuss, so I'm looking forward to it. Our very special guest, probably our most frequent guest, our good friend Edmund Fitton-Brown is joining us. Edmund is the former coordinator for the United Nations Sanctions and Monitoring Team, the former ambassador for the United Kingdom to Yemen. Currently, he's a senior advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project. And Edmund is our project director for FDD's Axis of Resistance project, which we are launching shortly. Edmund, welcome back to Generation Jihad. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be back and great to be on the team.
Yes, I'm really excited. I'm looking forward to the work we're going to do, not just with the Axis of Resistance project. Of course, that's with talking about that's Iran's Axis of Resistance, all of the militias and groups and that Iran supports throughout the Middle East. But Edmund and I have an opportunity to do more work with things like related to the jihadism side as well, and discuss the monitoring and team reports and any other key news. So, Edmund, it's really exciting time for us here at the Long War Journal and Generation Jihad to have you on board. Thank you again. Yeah. Well, so of course, we're going to discuss today the latest report we're just going to call it the monitoring team. I get tongue-tied every time I try to name it. I'm sure I got it wrong once or twice in the lead. The current report is out, and this covers Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's activities globally. I always say these reports are fascinating. I think it's the best product out there when looking at the threat of Al-Qaeda's networks, as well as the networks of the Islamic State pose to not just the United States, but to the international community. Never perfect. I think the facts in them are great. The monitoring team report is the monitoring team. Look, they never get everything 100% right, and I never agree 100% with their analysis. I'm sure Edmund would agree with that, and Caleb as well. But we're in a high degree of confidence with the information. The information is solid and it's stood up over the test of time, and the analysis is good. Certainly, there's points that are debatable. But before we get into the details of the report, Edmund, there's been some criticism online about this report, particularly because in issues like on Afghanistan, where it is completely in disagreement with the assessment from the Biden administration and U.S. intelligence. There's criticism how the team is formed, how it conducts its business, how it gathers its information. So, I know you've done this in the past, but can you just give us a brief refresher? How is the monitoring team comprised? How does it gather its information? Does it do its own analysis? Tell us how the sausage is made behind the scene.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that, Bill. And you're absolutely right. The monitoring team will never get everything right. We're reporting in a very sensitive area, an area that is, by definition, is highly secretive. And so, we're seeking to develop and share insights into these very shadowy groups and make complicated calculations about risk. So you're not ever going to get to 100% accuracy, but I think, as you said, this is the best thing out there, and the reason for that is as follows. So the monitoring team is, at its core, is 10 experts who have a wide range of previous background, but many of them have an intelligence background. Some of them have financial intelligence background. Some have legal background. Some have diplomatic background, and the monitoring team has a Security Council mandate, which is respected by the vast majority of member states, to engage with their counterterrorism agencies. That's to say their intelligence, security services, their national security structures, their defense agencies. And the monitoring team travels the world, and it goes and talks to people whom nobody else in the UN can access. And frankly, very few people who are writing in this field have access to those kind of people. And always with the consent of our interlocutors, the monitoring team would seek to declassify the information where that information was acknowledged to be declassifiable and put it into the public domain in these reports. So the kernel of these reports, and they are 10,500 words, they're long, they're detailed, they're global in their scope. And the kernel of this information is coming from intelligence services. Now, the key qualifier to that is to say that, of course, the monitoring team has its own capability to triangulate and to work out whether the information it's being given is credible or not. So sometimes a member state will say something that is plainly not credible. And in that kind of case, the monitoring team will not report it unless, and we might come to this in a moment in the podcast when we talk about the presence of Saif al-Adil in Iran, if that member state really wants to be quoted in saying something that's obviously not true, well, then maybe the monitoring team will say it, but with the caveat: one member state insists, one member state claims that this is true. So there is the ability to triangulate between different points of view. You might talk to two different member states that have very different perspectives on an event, and then you work out what you can say with a high level of confidence is true. And so that is one of the processes that the experts go through to produce the report. The experts are also supported by the United Nations Secretariat, and there is a technical edit process, but it's more than that. There is a huge amount of environmental support from the wider UN, the wider political affairs officers of the UN, who help the monitoring team to function and support it and provide it with an enormous amount of threshold information. What's in open source? What's in other relevant UN reporting? And so it means that anything outlandish is likely to be carefully challenged, both in terms of whether it fits with other member state reporting and also whether it's impossibly at odds with sort of widely accepted knowledge of what is true in other areas. And then the last thing I'll say about criticism is that, of course, the monitoring team welcomes criticism. It always wants to be told, maybe you should look at this possibility, or have you considered that actually that might be the explanation? So there's a constant learning process going on. I can certainly remember one point that you challenged a long time ago about Yemen, and I was in the monitoring team at that time. We went to great lengths to bottom out whether that was genuinely accurate. What we had said and what had been contradicted. Had we actually got it wrong, and what was the truth? So there is a learning process that goes on. But where we do, I think, draw the line is when you get ill-intentioned criticism. So, and the best example of this, and you'll love this, Bill, it's the Taliban. Every single time the monitoring team releases a report, the very next day, the Taliban immediately goes public and trashes it. Oh, this is all lies. Oh, this is all manipulation from the P5. It's all manipulation from the Americans or the Brits. We would never harbor terrorists in Afghanistan. We would never have a relationship with Al Qaeda. And that sort of criticism, well, frankly, we welcome it. There is nothing better than having a professional set of liars like the Taliban go head to head with our analysis. We know we're going to win that one.
Edmund, what always struck me, and you mentioned, I can't even remember what that was about Yemen, but what I do recall is, and again, this was, if I recall, Tom Jocelyn and I, was it over the death of
It was over the temporary incarceration of Khalid Batarfi.
Right. And what I remember about that incident was how welcoming you guys were to discuss that. And Tom and I understood where you were coming from. We understood the process that you were operating under. So, I'm not even sure what would say it was criticism as much as just, hey, this was a professional disagreement. and you made your point about this being I always say we're trying to look at terrorist organizations, how they're operating, what their leadership's like, what their intentions. We're peering into a black box, and we're reaching in there and grabbing pieces. We get bits of information. We're doing our best. Those who are honest about how, look, people always say about me, well, Bill, you just hate the Taliban and you'll always say they're aligned. But if I saw a clear break between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, I would report it tomorrow, because that's what there would be a change. That would be earth-shattering. Yeah, I would welcome that, first of all, because that would be a good thing. I still would think the Taliban was a bad organization. And we've reported, the split between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. We reported that. But anyway, my point being, I was always impressed by how you've conducted your business. A leader in this report, there's a report that the head of you're retracting something, but look, this was publicly out there that it was thought that the head of the Islamic State Khorasan province was killed a year ago. I think that was in the report a year ago. And your guys are now saying, hey, we don't think this is right. That's honesty. That's what analysts who are being honest do. And I'm just going to one real quick comment. There's actually an instance you mentioned the one member state says, there's an instance of that in the report. That's where Iran is denying that any members of Al-Qaeda. It doesn't say it's Iran, but who else is going to? I could read between the line. The report says one member state denies that, I'm paraphrasing, denies that Al-Qaeda leaders are present in Iran. Of course, Iran is going to be the state that's going to deny that. But that's good. It's in the report. You note it. There's pushback from one state. So again, these are all things that I find. This is what makes this report remarkable to me. I'm also going to take a real quick point to note. There is another organization that does great work, and that's the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. I always say if all U.S. government agencies operated like SIGAR and like the monitoring team, I'd actually have some confidence in my government and intelligence services. So.
And let me just say one disclaimer, Bill. Of course, I'm not with the monitoring team anymore.
Absolutely.
I don't know what that one member state was that denied the presence of Saif al-Adil in Iran. But as you say, reading between the lines, I'd be very surprised if it wasn't Iran.
Exactly. Well, let's get into that. Let's you had mentioned the report notes that Saif al-Adil is in Iran. His son is leading Al-Qaeda in Yemen. Let's kick this around. This isn't new news about Saif al-Adil being in Iran, but this is consistent reporting. What else does the report say about Saif al-Adil and his relationship with Iran, and how it's operating, or how he is interacting with Al-Qaeda, particularly in Afghanistan?
Yeah. So, and I think this is the right place to start, Bill, because this is, for me, one of the biggest features of the report is around this. Now, it's not specifically what it says about Saif, because, as you say, there actually isn't a huge amount of new information about Saif himself in the report. And, the fact that he's been long established in Iran is something that's old news. That's been true for many years. And what is interesting is the link to Yemen through his son, and the link to Afghanistan, and that question mark over. So, obviously, people listening to this, they will all know the story of Ayman al-Zawahiri and his killing in Afghanistan, and the fact that when he was killed, Saif al-Adil, the number 2, took over as the head of Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda could not say that. They still haven't said that publicly, because if they announce Saif as the leader of Al-Qaeda, they would be acknowledging that Ayman al-Zawahiri was dead. And the Taliban, of course, have spun one of their ridiculous lies about Al-Qaeda. They claim that they looked at the site of this outrageous American intervention in Kabul, and they could see no evidence at all that anyone answering to the description of Ayman al-Zawahiri was in the rubble. And so because the Taliban have camped out on that, they've effectively denied that Ayman al-Zawahiri was ever in Afghanistan, and therefore denied that he was killed in Kabul. It puts Al-Qaeda in a very difficult position, because they can't announce their new leader without contradicting the Taliban's narrative. And there's a whole dynamic going on there between Afghanistan and Iran, and it's very well covered, I think, in the report. What you have essentially is, it is true that the Taliban has concerns about what it does for their interests if extremists in Afghanistan do something directly to embarrass them. And there is nothing more embarrassing than getting yourself droned in the middle of Kabul. So they are cautious. And it means that, it's highly unlikely, for example, that the still substantial al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan poses an immediate threat of external operations. But, of course, the report has a lot of good information about training camps and things of that kind. And an interesting sort of geographical point that a lot of the sort of AQ-associated installations appear to be not too far from the Iranian border. And so I think what we know from, this is other source reporting, this is nothing to do with the monitoring team, and it's not well established, but you've got conversations going on between the Iranians and the Taliban about, what do we do to manage the risk? Of course we support al-Qaeda, but we don't want to bring on kinetic action, and so there's a question mark there about how the Iranians and the Afghans between them manage that association with al-Qaeda. And so I think it's probably true that the activity that is happening in Afghanistan is somewhat limited in its scope, although very interestingly, the report points to AQIS, al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, licensed involvement with the Pakistani Taliban in terrorist activity against Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan is furious about this. It's, I suppose it feels disappointed that having been very supportive of the Afghan Taliban while they were in the insurgency, the Afghan Taliban is colluding with the Pakistani Taliban to allow and indeed to support terrorist activity inside Pakistan. So that's another part of this complicated dynamic. The last part of this complicated dynamic, and I think we might want to come to it as a separate item on AQAP, but we mentioned Saif's son is in Yemen. And what is that about? And at least part of it, of course, is that Saif will be thinking, okay, I'm in Iran right now, but what if I had to leave? Where would I go? Could I go to Kabul? Probably not. Could I go to some obscure location in Western Afghanistan near the Iranian border? Maybe. But could I go to Yemen? That's also a possibility.
Yeah, let me, and I misidentified his son as the leader of al-Qaeda. He's a leader within al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I'm going to read directly what the report says about his son. I'm going to strip out some of the notations in here, but here it goes. Quote, al-Qaeda further tightened control over AQAP, especially through the son of Saif al-Adil. His name is Khalid Mohammed Salahuddin Zindani, who resides in Yemen and is close to AQAP senior leadership. Khalid delivers al-Qaeda directives and plays a critical role in recruitment, media, and managing AQAP internal strife. His travels to southern Yemen have intensified since mid-August, with his movements protected by the security leader Ibrahim al-Bana. Yes, it's an interesting dynamic. AQAP has played an important role for al-Qaeda. Remember that Nasser al-Wahishi, who served as Osama bin Laden's aide-de-camp, he was al-Qaeda's general manager. The U.S. killed him in a drone strike in 2016, I believe. But he was, as general manager, he was in direct line to take control of al-Qaeda, very influential. So Yemen has always played a critical node for al-Qaeda. It's part of its leadership, and this is part of al-Qaeda diversifying its leadership out of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which they began doing once the U.S. drone campaign kicked up I would say, really intensified under President Bush in 2008. I want to turn to, we'll turn to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but before we do that, I want to stay on Yemen real quick. The report notes that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula may be in some kind of truce with the Houthis, and I found that to be a very interesting point, because I've noticed that AQAP is mainly conducting its attacks against the Saudi, UAE, and the nominal Yemeni government, the rump Yemeni government. But most of the reports of its attacks are all directed against them. I really haven't seen activity against the Houthi. So this is one of those things where the report mentions this, and that gives it a lot of credence. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Yeah, Edmund?
Absolutely, and again, this is the critical sort of final leg of this sort of al-Qaeda central discussion, including Afghanistan, including Iran, including the association with TTP and the attacks on Pakistan, and then including Yemen. And I also want to just make that point. If you're looking for big themes in this report, I think a big theme is the truce between extremists. And that exists in this truce between Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Houthis. But it also, of course, exists very troublingly in the Western Sahel. And I know we'll come to this with Caleb later, where instead of killing each other, you now have ISGS, the Greater Sahara, and JNIM, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, having deconflicted and formed a truce, and obviously then becoming collectively much more of a threat than when they were wasting a lot of their energy on killing each other. So that is another interesting general theme of the report. But coming back to your point about AQAP, this is really interesting and important. This link with Saif Sun and Saif Sun's involvement with media. Now, remember, quite apart from the Houthis in Yemen and what's been happening in the Red Sea recently, the two crucial things about AQAP were, first of all, media, the media activity of AQAP, and secondly, it was the external threat, and that was particularly through innovative IED technology. And they had that master bomb technician, of course, Assiri, who was also taken out by the United States, but not before. He had sort of established AQAP as a sort of a leader in that field. It was one of their sort of specializations, and it kind of defines their ambition as an aggressive branch of of Al-Qaeda. So why is this interesting? This is really interesting post 7th of October. And the reason for that is because, again, this is a major theme of the report, and it is the agility of Al-Qaeda in responding to and exploiting the 7th of October and the events that followed, and in particular, the footage that is emerging of the consequences of the Israeli military operation in Gaza. And this is where Al-Qaeda, and I know this is music to your ears, Bill, because you've always talked about Al-Qaeda as the bigger long-term strategic threat than ISIL. Al-Qaeda is so much better placed on this than ISIL is, because ISIL is obsessed with its unbending theology, and Hamas are apostates. They participate in elections. They claim to be nationalists. They're not good Muslims. So ISIL has struggled to benefit from the inspiration provided by the fact that there is now a spike in global Muslim feeling against Israel, whereas Al-Qaeda, through patient old Zawahiri and all of his writings on Jerusalem, Al-Qaeda was particularly well placed to respond, and they responded fast. And I think this reflects the fact that they now have more agile leadership, and Saif is more agile than Zawahiri was. And Saif's son is a very effective arm of his father in Yemen. And so you had this sudden ramping up of Al-Qaeda propaganda being published from Yemen, from AQAP, to seize on the moment, to gain that inspiration for Al-Qaeda and for inspired attacks to take place. And this is something that we should all be concerned about. This is why the report says that the threat has increased in non-conflict zones in places like Europe. It's because the risk of somebody being inspired to attack post 7th of October has increased, and Al-Qaeda are seeking to surf that wave. And they look as if they are surfing it quite successfully, although obviously it's premature because we haven't seen concrete results yet. And then the last thing, the key thing here to finish on, is this truce between Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Houthis. And the Houthis are a proxy of Iran, and Saif al-Adil, the leader of Al-Qaeda, is in Iran, and his son is in Yemen. And we have to ask ourselves, is this a coincidence? Iran is the ringmaster of the axis of resistance, and the extent to which Iran can also co-opt Al-Qaeda in that axis of resistance, maybe not as a fully fledged member of it, but nevertheless as a sort of an asset and even an occasional proxy. That is really interesting. And whether that dynamic is one of the reasons why AQAP and the Houthis are no longer killing each other is a really important question to be answered.
Well, and the last thing Edmund just said, I think whether Iran can co-opt Al Qaeda. There's historical precedents for that. I mean, the 1998 embassy bombings, they trained with the suicide bombings. Uh, the members were trained in Lebanon by Hezbollah on the orders of Iran. So there's historical precedent for that for sure. Another thing I want to bring up is the speed and tenacity of Al Qaeda's media, not just from ACAP, but around the world on the current war in Gaza has been tremendous. You've seen Shabab put out numerous statements. You've seen Shabab host pro-Palestine rallies inside their territories. You saw the West African branch, JNM, release a statement. AQIM came out of its moribund status to release a statement. AQIS released a statement. So this is a coordinated effort being driven by Al Qaeda's leadership to really capitalize on this collective anger around the images that Edmund brought up from Gaza. And I think this is the more important part is that flexibility that they've seen because they are decentralized, if that makes sense. Al Qaeda has a decentralized media apparatus for each sort of branch has their own media wings. This allows Al Qaeda more flexibility than the Islamic State, which not only being so obsessed over this religious, rigidness is the centrality of the organization. Everything has to come from the central. Everything has to come from the top. So the messaging that the Islamic State has done on the war in Gaza has come from its central leadership. It really kind of limits the branches of what they could actually do, at least publicly facing. Obviously we don't know what's happening behind the scenes, or in some cases on the ground where there's less reporting, but at least in open source, public facing, all the messaging from the Islamic State's coming from the top, whereas Al Qaeda kind of spread that message out from not only the top, but on the ground as well, as we're seeing in Somalia.
That's excellent, Caleb. You had written some excellent reports on this, and I know you're quite aware of the Al Qaeda's messaging. And while they're decentralized in their media, you see
decentralized operations, but it's centralized media strategy.
Exactly.
I should have worded that better, but that's what it is. Is they all have their own media outlets, but the overall media strategy is
and
coordinated.
The themes of what they're saying is very similar, and that is
you see
clearly
you see that all the time.
Yeah. In the announcements of when a leader is killed or when a new leader is appointed.
Not only an Al Qaeda leader. Let's say that there's a big name jihadi killed, not necessarily a part of Al Qaeda. What we would consider Al Qaeda proper. All the branches will release a statement eulogizing that figure, which suggests something from the top. Or another thing is when Shabab and JNIM did their Jerusalem will not be Judaized campaign starting in 2019. Obviously, these were two separate campaigns in both West Africa and East Africa. Yet those directives had to come from somewhere that they're doing them at the same exact time.
Yeah, no coincidence there. All right, let's turn to the report on Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. This, of course, was of great interest to me. The previous reporting noted Al Qaeda was running training camps in 6 of the 34 provinces. The new report expands upon that. Or the current report says that Al Qaeda opened 8 new training camps in an additional 4 provinces. So now Al Qaeda is running training camps in 10 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. It says some of these camps may be transitory. Yeah, probably so. The other thing it says is Al Qaeda is running madrasas in 5 different provinces. Of course, these are religious schools that are used, I'm going to assume, to train the youth of Afghanistan on Al Qaeda's ideology. There's a new base to, quote, stock weaponry, end quote, in Panjshir, of all places, that Al Qaeda is stockpiling weaponry in Panjshir province. Panjshir, if we all recall, that was where the last vestiges of the resistance to the Taliban with the the National Resistance Front, previously the Northern Alliance. So Al Qaeda not only took a bastion of anti-Al Qaeda sentiment and resistance and made it into their armory, and then it also describes a facilitation network into Iran. It identifies a network that is being used to in 3 separate provinces. So it's interesting. The previous report noted that Al Qaeda is running safe houses in 4 provinces. The current report noted that the safe houses are in the same 4 provinces: Herat, Farah, Helmand, and Kabul province. But Herat, Farah, and Helmand are all on the border. And this report notes that Al Qaeda, quote, maintains safe houses to facilitate the movement between, I'm assuming, of members between Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So what do we have here? Look, this is one of the areas where I disagree with the analysis of the report. It identifies the Islamic State Khorasan province as being a greater threat to Afghanistan and to the region and the international community. I absolutely disagree with that assessment, because look at what we're witnessing here. Al-Qaeda is building the infrastructure. The report note that Al-Qaeda is in some way constrained. I agree with that. I also believe my analysis of this is Al-Qaeda is constraining itself, and it's using the time to build this terrorist infrastructure, safe houses, training camps, the network into Iran, stockpiling weapons. I mean, what do we think Al-Qaeda's is ultimate goal to use all of this for? But anyway, that being said, this is what, to me, what makes Al-Qaeda far more dangerous. And the other thing too, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, which is supported by Al-Qaeda, some of these camps are being used to train Al-Qaeda suicide bombers, is launching far more attacks in the region in Pakistan than the Islamic State is doing inside of Afghanistan and any other country. So this is where, again, it's an analytical disagreement I have with the sanctions and monitoring team, the monitoring team's report. But we're allowed to disagree. Edmund, your thoughts on this point?
Yeah, I think it's possible to square the circle. Bill, I agree with you, and at the same time, I understand what it is that the report is saying. You're absolutely right. If you say, once you take in the Pakistan dimension and the association between Al-Qaeda and TTP, you are talking about some really serious international terrorist activity. And if I were sitting in Islamabad, I would see that as being, a very, very serious threat. I think, for some time, the consensus that we've seen from member states has been that the next big attack in the West, or in a non-conflict zone, so not where there's already, where these groups are embedded in insurgencies and able to carry out a lot of violence already, but that eye-catching event on the streets of Paris or the streets of London, streets of New York, wherever, that the most likely source of that next attack was probably ISIL rather than Al-Qaeda. Now, I think it's absolutely up for debate as to whether the 7th of October has changed that calculation. And the report doesn't claim to draw a conclusion on that, but it does flag up the fact that Al-Qaeda has exploited the 7th of October effectively. But going back to Afghanistan, I agree that the activity of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is extremely concerning, and it should be extremely concerning to us all as a medium to long-term threat. But it is also true that a clear and present danger in the non-conflict zones over recent years and right up to the minute has been established to be posed by ISIL Khorasan. And I don't mean just the ISIL Khorasan attack in Iran, which was a big one, but also the use by ISIL Khorasan of Central Asian nationals, particularly Tajiks, sometimes Uzbeks, and the number of those sort of, I would say, inspired but also partially facilitated attack plots that have been frustrated in Europe recently, and there are current court cases, people who are being prosecuted right now. There have been recent arrests. And so I think that still gives you a reason to be very concerned about ISIL Khorasan. And therefore, the distinction I would make is that, if there were to be a mass murder on the streets of Berlin tomorrow, I would think it was most likely to be associated with ISIL Khorasan rather than with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I guess I look for more. I see that infrastructure being built with the support of the state, which is the Taliban. There's just a greater long-term threat, greater capacity for Al-Qaeda if it decides to unleash it. But yeah, I mean, this is just a matter of ranking a threat right here. This is where the disagreement lies. Caleb, you have any thoughts on this subject?
I mean, just to double on what Edmund said about the Central Asians, I mean, the Islamic State, its Khorasan province does sort of maintain a local propaganda arm. And this is, I guess I'm kind of contradicting myself earlier, but there are exceptions to every rule. For whatever reason, Khorasan province is allowed to have its own media apparatus. And I think this is hugely because of the Central Asians. because ISIL-K or ISIS-K, whatever you want to call it, they are really reaching out to Tajiks, Uzbeks, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, whatever, and they've really ramped it up in the last few months. There's Lucas Weber at Militant Wire. He does a great job of covering this, but it's really staggering of the last, again, several months of just how much propaganda is coming out in Tajik and Uzbek language. And I think this is partly why ISIL-K is allowed to have that, is they are reaching out to Uzbeks and Tajiks, not only in Afghanistan and in the region, but the diaspora. And they're, increasingly very effective at that. So I would agree with Edmund on, at least in the short term, if we're looking at attacks in Europe from a Central Asian, it's more than likely going to be ISIS-K than Al-Qaeda. But, medium to long term, as we've stated numerous times on this podcast, as we've written about many times, the long-term threat is always going to be Al-Qaeda. That's just how they operate. That's how they think. Whereas the Islamic State is more immediate, and we need it now.
Let's turn to the Islamic State and its new leader. We don't even know who he is. For the first time, there's uncertainty over his nationality and even where he is located. So it was, previously the Islamic State's leader has either been in Iraq or in Syria. So this would be if the new leader of Al-Qaeda or of the Islamic State is not based in Iraq or Syria, this would be something earth-shattering in my opinion. Edmund, tell us what the report says about the Islamic State's new leader or its caliph, and what this means.
Yeah, I think this is a central feature of the new report, and indeed it is in paragraph 1. Overview and evolution of the threat is where this is tackled, and I think rightly so. So, as you know, ISIL has lost a succession of leaders, and their life expectancy was just getting progressively shorter. So, Baghdadi actually lasted for quite a while, and then his successor lasted for a couple of years. And then you were down to people who would only, they'd take the job and they'd be dead within the year. And so this intense counter-terrorist pressure that they were under, and yet they kept appointing the same kind of person again and again. It was always an Iraqi. And the person was normally located in Syria. And we sort of, up until this report, we had taken that as being their modus operandi with the leadership. But one thing I want to highlight from the previous report from 6 months ago was that they reported the death of a man called Abu Sara al-Iraqi, who was the head of the General Directorate of Provinces. And that guy was described as maybe as a sort of a shadow leader of the organization. So he wasn't actually the number one, but he was perhaps the most powerful and the most important, most influential figure within the organization. And he was killed a year ago. And maybe that death was more important than the deaths of the various titular caliphs, because what you feel now is that for the first time, there's an existential problem over succession. Maybe they're running out of people to appoint. Maybe the bench is getting depleted of people that they can actually bring up as new leaders. Maybe it is just that sense that every time they appoint someone, there's almost like an investigative thread from the previous killing, and it follows that person, until 6 months later they're dead as well. And so, for all of those reasons, I read into paragraph 1 of this report a hint that they think that the business model may change, and that maybe this new guy, Abu Hafs, again, this is a nom de guerre, it's a kunya, it doesn't mean anything. It's a name they can use in propaganda. Abu Hafs says that you must, fight the infidel, you must kill them wherever you find them, and that sort of thing. So they can put a name to this faceless individual, but that name is meaningless. It's not the name by which somebody has a driving license or a passport. And of course, you want to find out, who is this person? What is their civil ID? Where did they go to school? Why did they become a terrorist? Have they spent time in prison or in US custody or whatever it might be? And we know nothing about this guy. And there is this hint in paragraph 1 that maybe this time it's not an Iraqi, and maybe this time they're not in Syria. So this is obviously a huge intelligence gap that needs to be answered, and I hope that people will be studying it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, I think it was either last podcast on the last report or some
Read
other
my
time we
mind,
talked
Caleb.
about,
Yeah.
because I brought up the possibility of, what are the chances that the Islamic State, with all these leadership losses, kind of take the Al Qaeda model of this, geographically dispersed leadership, and it seems like the monitoring team is now kind of, you know, gauging that possibility, and I think that it's a strong possibility because, as Bill said earlier, when the drone campaign ramped up on Al Qaeda during the Obama administration, they were forced to, and then the Islamic State is really facing the same thing now, where they can't keep leaderships, and they are shifting away probably from caliphs to people like Abu Sara, where they are, the GDP is more relevant than the actual caliph, but still, like having a geographically dispersed leadership only insulates your leadership. To me, it just seems like a standard chain of progression here that they turn to that model. So it really made me happy to see that the UN report mentions that possibility.
Yeah, and I think we may have mentioned this in the last podcast that we did on this, Caleb. It seems to me that Abu Sara, right? That the
Abu Sara al-Iraqi.
Yeah, he it was almost like he was described as Al Qaeda's, what Al Qaeda would call its general manager, right? The guy.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially it, because the GDP oversees all the provinces, all the regional offices, which the regional offices are kind of the middle managers anyway.
Yeah, so that's what I recall us having that discussion, and that's what really fascinated me about this report. It's look, do we know the answer to this? No. It interesting that the United Nations is possibly coming to the same conclusion that me have. And again, we're just guessing. We're peering into the black box, but it looks
taking
right.
Precedent. Yeah, we're taking precedent of what's happened to the other big global jihadi group.
And look, I wouldn't be shocked if someone came along tomorrow and said, "Nope, that's not the way it is." And the Islamic State says, "Here's our structure." They're never going to do that and come out and tell us. But yeah, these are the interesting pieces of information that we glean.
And it's just to add on to this, it just seems like the natural progression because you had Abu Sar, but there was another individual that was based in Somalia that was playing an outsized role for what his position actually was, and that was Bilal al-Sudani. He was the head of the Al-Qarar regional office in northern Somalia, Puntland. He was directing a lot of the funding, the operations, the support, logistical stuff for the Islamic State in Central Africa, Mozambique, and South Africa. But not only that, the last UN sanctions report mentioned that Al-Qarar was sending, I think it was like $25,000, either a month or a year, to ISIL-K.
It was monthly, Caleb, because I remember we were
monthly. Of course not. Yeah, and that was led by al-Sudani. So this is, to me, suggests that he was a way more influential leader than just someone in Somalia. So you were already kind of seeing, if you want to read the tea leaves, that they were kind of transitioning to, we're going to place these strategically important people around the world that kind of, insulate our top leadership.
It makes sense. If they want to survive as an organization, they have to adapt. This is what Al Qaeda learned in the late 2000s, and yeah, there were problems for Al Qaeda. Yeah, it lost what the government, U.S. intelligence services call key legacy leaders. And people think, well, once the legacy leaders are killed, well, you've defeated the group. But that really discounts that there's up and comers. No one knew who Abu Sar al-Iraqi was. Was he, how old was he? Was he an initial founder of the Islamic State? It didn't matter. He was by the time of his death, he was a very influential individual. And these groups are resilient. They're adaptable too. That's what, and again, if the Islamic State takes this model, I view them, they get upped into look, Al Qaeda, Islamic State, they're both very dangerous organizations. I always take it the Al Qaeda plays the long game and they're more adaptable and more willing to compromise with local jihadist groups and play well with others' countries. That's what makes them more dangerous. But as the Islamic State,
not only local jihadist groups, local armed groups in general.
Exactly.
Which we should talk about. It mentions that in the report in the Sahel, where JNIM is kind of working with local Malian, Azawadi groups, or Azawad being the name that the local Tuaregs use for their nominal independent state. JNIM has taken that role, I guess, of working with non-jihadi groups against the Malian state. That's Al Qaeda's MO. They do that all the time. They don't necessarily have to work with jihadis as long as they're working towards the same nominal goal. And that's what makes them more dangerous to me.
Yep, exactly. Any last thoughts on this, gentlemen, before we turn to West Africa?
I mean, just the mention of Bilal al-Sudani. I'm glad Caleb mentioned it. That's a recent episode, an important episode, and the fact that Al Qarar office had emerged as the essential node for funding for ISIL, and indeed Bilal al-Sudani was killed by the Americans specifically because they attributed his funding activities to some of the ISIL operations in Afghanistan. So that shows that flexibility within ISIL. We shouldn't be. They've set out this regional network structure. It's been more successful in some. Some offices have flourished more than others. Some networks have flourished more than others. They've made some adjustments to which presences belong to which networks. But fundamentally, it shows that they are globally flexible. And so, yes, I mean, I think we have to be open-minded about where the threat will concentrate.
And the point about some branches or some provinces being more effective than others, there's an ebb and flow to that. We've seen that with Al Qaeda, right? AQAP at one point was the preeminent Al Qaeda branch, and then the U.S. focused attention on it, killed some key leaders, and was launching drone strikes, degrading Al Qaeda capabilities in Yemen to a degree. And then the civil war broke out there, and I think that hurt Al Qaeda as well. The Houthis constrained Al Qaeda to some degree. Somalia, in Somalia, the Shabab is probably, I would call, Al Qaeda's preeminent branch, but things are looking good in West Africa. Things are looking good in, so in Afghanistan, there's an ebb and flow to this, and that's the point. These groups, if they can adapt to that, sometimes groups become moribund and they come back in. And in the early or to late 2000s, Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb was a very powerful branch of Al Qaeda. Algeria and other countries crack down on them, but they're still there, and that persistence makes these groups is what makes these groups, and adaptability is what makes these groups dangerous. Let's move on to West Africa. Continues to slide into instability. Caleb, give us a breakdown. What is happening there, and what does the report say about Al Qaeda and the Islamic State operations in West Africa?
So I'll only mention the Sahel and some of the coastal states, and then Edmund can touch on Nigeria if he wants to. But for at least the Sahel, the report, correctly mentions that JNIM is expanding activities not only in Mali but in Burkina Faso and Niger, and then spreading into the coastal states of Benin, Ghana, Togo, Ivory Coast. This has been long-standing and stuff that's been happening for the last several years that we at the Long War Journal have covered extensively. So I don't really need to talk too much about that because it's consistent with what's been happening. But more importantly is, some of the minor tidbits that kind of throws in there that I mentioned earlier of, the report mentions JNIM is working with local Tuareg factions against the Malian army. And this is sort of in response to the Malian army kind of going to war against these Tuareg factions. Now, I mean, not to get bogged down in history, but I did write an entire 90-page thesis on this for grad school. It was published at West Point. But anyway, Al Qaeda's MO for that region is that they do work with local organizations. So in 2012, when Al Qaeda took over northern Mali, they did that with the help of these Tuareg groups, and then eventually, betrayed them. Well, they never really lost ties with a lot of these groups, either due to familial connections, clan connections, whatever. So they've always had a relationship with some of these clan-based, militia units in northern Mali. And that's what the report is talking about. As the Malian army is clashing with some of them, they're turning to JNIM as sort of as a protector, as a auxiliary force, or vice versa. So I think that's super interesting and something that observers need to be more observant of. Is that as if those relationships deepen, if they worsen, that could really affect the conflict in northern Mali. And then secondly is this détente between JNIM and ISGS that Edmund mentioned earlier. Now, JNIM and ISGS have had a détente before. They were some of the last two Al Qaeda and Islamic State branches, respectively, to go to war with each other. But that earlier détente went into just absolutely bloody warfare. I mean, for years, hundreds of fighters on both sides were killed. And then last summer, we got some rumblings on local reports that, hey, these groups stopped fighting each other. They seem to have this secret alliance. And you can kind of see that in the attack patterns where it seems like JNIM has kind of let ISGS have Manaka, which is in the extreme north of Mali. If ISGS doesn't really attack JNIM in like the tri-border region of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And that seems to be holding. So it's really cool to see the UN confirming those rumors, confirming those reports that détente actually did happen and is still holding to this day. Obviously, the big question is, when does that break? If it breaks, because it's going to be another shit show for northern Mali, worse than it already is. Because what is effectively happening is these zones of influence, where JNIM is consolidating their power over a lot of northern Mali, but leaving the extreme north to ISGS. So ISGS now is physically controlling territory in northern Mali, implementing Sharia, doing the Hudud punishments, doing what they normally do elsewhere, and this is good for the global Islamic State image. But as the report also notes, the IS Central doesn't really highlight a lot of what they do in the Sahel, for a number of reasons probably, but they do underreport what's actually happening there. So ISGS is probably a lot stronger, doing a lot more than what they actually are showing to the world. And then lastly, just to mention, kind of tee it up for Edmund if he wants to talk about Nigeria, is that as JNIM is pushing further into coastal West Africa, ISGS also has a nominal presence sort of in northern Benin, where they've sort of used the national forests of northern Benin as a transit route between Nigeria and the Sahel to move fighters and equipment and supplies. So both groups are now sort of threatening a contiguous battle space, effectively from Mauritania, the borders of Mauritania, all the way down to Cameroon. With Al Qaeda's nominal branch in Nigeria and Saru being sort of that force multiplier for them in Nigeria. Though the UN report does mention that Ansaru was sort of not where they should be capability-wise, even though they pledge allegiance to AQIM, JNIM, and nominally support them. It seems like they've been kind of bogged down with interfighting with bandits that they used to support in northwest Nigeria, and that's sort of hindering their capabilities to link up with JNIM. But regardless, we're now facing this contiguous, battle space threat from, again, the borders of Mauritania to Cameroon, and that is a huge, worrying, threat that is actually a real possibility now. Which, if anyone would have said that 10 years ago, you would have been called crazy, or a warmonger, as most people like to call us.
Right. Yeah, because we want to create the Islamic State and Al Qaeda in these countries. That's all we're into. Yeah. Go ahead, Edmund.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant piece of analysis by Caleb. I mean, really, really well set out, and completely endorse what he said. I just add one point, of course, this break off from ECOWAS, the having Nigeria, Mali, and Nigeria, Mali, and Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, break off from ECOWAS, and that's very troubling. So you've got this sort of fault line that Caleb is describing. Actually now playing out as even a fault line in a regional organization, and of course this is linked with the sort of collapse of governance in those countries as well. In the coup in Niger, military rule in Mali, similar problems in Burkina. And of course, from ECOWAS's point of view, they saw that as a problem, and I don't know how well that's been handled internally, but clearly it hasn't gone well, and now you have an actual fracture. And the worry, of course, is that three countries. They're all big countries in terms of their surface area. So we're talking about a large proportion of the whole Western Sahel, and with the governance problems there, and of course the fact that they would rather they'd rather contract in help from somebody like Wagner rather than traditional counterterrorism alliances. This is compounding the problem even further. And so here again, I want to mention a little bit of a crisis, I think, in sort of from the UN's point of view, and I don't mean the monitoring team, I mean the wider UN, and France, because France had this sort of special position of influence in these countries, and that has gone really badly wrong. And so France has effectively lost its influence in Mali, in Burkina, in Niger. The United Nations has been kicked out of Mali, so this the United Nations mission, MINUSMA, which was a huge mission in Mali, is in the process of evacuating from Mali. And what this is doing, I think, is it's calling into question the whole regional dynamic. Do people want to rely on their Western alliances, traditional Western partnerships? Do they want to rely on the UN? But then all the baggage that brings in terms of the UN wanting you to sign up for all sorts of agendas that the UN insists on, whether related to gender or things of that kind, which are often difficult sells in these more traditional societies. So I think we have the makings here of a massive collapse of governance problem at the heart of the Sahel, and with obvious ramifications for a future terrorist threat. Let's suppose that one of these countries, Niger, Mali or Burkina, partly or entirely ends up in the hands of one of these terrorist groups, then how long before that turns into a launching base for attacks outside the region? So that's a major concern. And then following Caleb's invitation to go on to Nigeria, and I thought his point about Ansari was absolutely spot on. It is interesting, basically northern Nigeria has a lot of problems of extremism and banditry. It is odd that northwestern Nigeria hasn't fully integrated itself into this sort of contiguous area of jihadi instability, but it is still it's highly problematic, and Ansari is problematic, and it is associated with Al Qaeda. So I agree that this is a threat that then spreads all the way across to the IS West Africa Province area of operations. Now, IS West Africa Province is based in northeastern Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. So it crosses over the borders into Cameroon and into Chad and into Niger, into eastern Niger. And ISWAP, West Africa Province, is also the host of the Al-Furqan office of ISIS. And so the Al-Furqan office is one of the three offices that people talk about as having really thrived in this ISIL global structure. So we've already talked about the Al-Qarar office in Somalia, the Al-Sadiq office is in Afghanistan, and then the Al-Furqan office in the Lake Chad Basin. And the report is, there's not a huge amount here about Algeria, but what there is very worrying. And it includes this figure of 4,000 to 7,000 ISWAP fighters. Now that's a lot. That's maybe the largest single fighting force of ISIL fighters anywhere in the world now. I think it's now bigger than ISIL Khorasan and any other ISIL affiliate. So they continue to have a lot of success against the Nigerian military. The Nigerian military is strong, but it hasn't been very successful in its tactics. You haven't just got ISWAP there. You have also got the sort of the remnants of Boko Haram. That's still not gone away. And where that's going to end up, the report talks about two factions of Boko Haram, and will they sort of end up linking up with allegiance to Al Qaeda, allegiance to ISIS, merger with ISWAP? Not entirely clear, but they add to the general instability and violence, which is troubling the borders with Cameroon, the borders with Chad, the borders with Niger, and of course, that part of Nigeria, you're not far from a major city. Maiduguri it's a big city with an airport, and so again, you think, well, at what point does ISWAP sort of raid into sort of a serious urban centre? So I think there's a huge amount to worry about with this. And the final point I do want to make about this, and it's not there's not much about it in the report, but I think one of the things that we're missing when we talk about terror finance in Africa, and I'd be fascinated in Caleb's view of this, is the source of the money. So, Al-Qarar office was famously moving money. They were getting money to where it needed to go. and including all the way to Afghanistan. And that was a remarkable thing. But it's firmly established as a reality that really happened. We don't quite know what the impact of the killing of Soudani was on the Al-Qarar office. I haven't seen any evidence that the Al-Qarar office has stopped doing what it was doing. But, it may be that if al-Sudani was a sort of a genius in this form of, moving money, managing networks for financial transfers, maybe Al-Qarar office has taken a hit from that. I certainly hope it has. But Al-Furqan is a big and very significant office. And if we think that the money that they are moving is not just coming from ISIL core, it's not just being sort of moved in, maybe indirectly through Turkey or something of that kind and then moved on from Somalia. But if we're also talking about fundraising in Africa, and I think we must be, then the question is, wealthy donors in Africa, particularly in wealthy countries like South Africa and Nigeria, to what extent is there money that is funneling into this financial pipeline for ISIL within Africa? And I feel that we're talking about intelligence gaps. There is a big intelligence gap here on Nigeria, because Nigeria is a huge economy, and there are a lot of very wealthy individuals, and it's a very divided society with a strong sense of people in the north that they don't feel properly represented by the national government or in the national government. And so I think we need to get to the source of the funds. And is Al-Furqan office now stepping up and taking on part of the role that Al-Qarar office has been carrying out?
Bill, if I could make the transition
Absolutely.
here, I think this is stepping into basically my day-to-day job. Bridgeway, my other employer, we've written an entire paper on sort of the financing in East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa as part of our field work that we've done across all those regions over the last 2 years, sort of following that money that Edmund is talking about. And the big thing of the source is, especially for Nigeria, there have been wealthy donors, but if we look at East, Central, and Southern Africa, it's crime. It is largely sourced by crime, by extortion, by quote unquote taxes on businesses, by robberies, kidnappings for ransom, in both Somalia and South Africa, wherein this money is then pulled together by Al-Qarar and then dispersed across the network, either in Nairobi, in Kampala, in Maputo, in Mozambique, and Johannesburg, wherever an Islamic State cell, network, group, whatever, within that Al-Qarar sphere of influence needs the money, that's where it's going to go. And I think there still is a large intelligence gap, because after Bilal Soudani, by all indications, it doesn't seem to have stopped. So this is something that the international community really needs to work on, especially in East, Central, and Southern Africa, is pulling resources together to follow that money and sort of stop it. Which is, again, I understand it's easier said than done, but this is something that countering finance needs to be done. It is looking at criminal networks as part of this fundraising apparatus for the Islamic State. And the report kind of mentions this with a weird caveat. They have, member states noted that it is a misnomer to identify the network operational in East and Central Africa as ISIL. Rather, it is a network of veteran battle-hardened fighters and religious figures who have, at some stage, all worked together. ... ISIL is effectively leveraging these pre-existing networks in an attempt to build a viable structure in the region. That's true, but it's sort of only half true. They've largely pre-existed the Islamic State, these criminal networks, especially smuggling networks in between Somalia and Yemen, where IS Somalia has also raised funds or gotten funds smuggled through. But all of these networks know who they're working for. They know that they're doing this on the behest of or at the orders of the Islamic State, regional leaders, or sometimes they've openly pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. So yes, they've pre-existed, but for all intents and purposes, they are the Islamic State, and this is how the Islamic State operates. In sort of that sphere of Africa. I don't have much experience in West Africa or Nigeria for that office, but at least if we extrapolate what's happening in Al-Qarar, we could probably make the safe assumption that other offices are operating the same way. Although I just know from open source reporting that ISWAP in Nigeria has gotten donations from wealthy Muslims, especially in the Gulf. That really hasn't happened so much, for ISIS, Central Africa Province and DRC or Mozambique. But that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, or it hasn't happened and just no one has detected it.
Caleb, if I can make a really simple analogy, a lawyer who represents the mafia and who's intimately involved with their business and provides advice to mafia leaders, we would call them a mafia lawyer, right?
That would be a consigliere.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, so if I'm in accounting or if I'm a financial network that is working closely with the Islamic State, I think it would be safe to assume to call it.
And just in the paper that we wrote, it was published at GWU. But one of the financial facilitators in Johannesburg, who kind of ran one of these networks, he wasn't ideological. He was purely in it for the money. However, and here's the big thing: he still knew who he was working for. He still knew who that was benefiting, even though he himself wasn't ideological. So that there's two elements there that really I think people should pay attention to. Of these criminal networks sometimes pre-exist and also maybe not be ideologically aligned with IS. They're still taking the money from, and they know what they're actually benefiting. So yeah, sure, that caveat they added is half right, but it seems more of pressure from more local governments to say that than what it actually is. But minor gripe.
Just to say, I completely agree with Caleb on this. I think he's got it spot on, and I just want to make the analogy with examples from elsewhere in the world. So let's move away from Africa and talk about pre-existing groups in Southeast Asia that pledged allegiance to ISIL, or indeed a group like the one in Jowzjan in Afghanistan that was ex-Taliban that went and pledged allegiance to ISIL a few years ago. The fact that you're a pre-existing group, or indeed the fact that you're wrapped up with facilitation and organized crime that is non-ideological, is no bar to being considered part of ISIL. And if you've pledged allegiance, and if ISIL has accepted that allegiance, and if you are colluding with a regional network structure that is designed both to move propaganda in one direction, so that sort of videos and coverage of operations gets out into the world, and technical help or people or money can be provided also through that structure, then you're ISIL.
I couldn't agree more. I think the distinctions are being made here for various reasons. Probably some countries want to soften the blow of maybe their people involved in their people being involved with this is doesn't look good. But
some countries may not be doing enough to stop it. Once to obfuscate the actual relationship.
Yep, exactly. Last topic. Let's move on to East Africa. We have a lot going on in East Africa. It's not just Somalia. Somalia is obviously a big part of it. I'm going to read what the report says about what Shabab and Somalia, and then we'll start the discussion on the wider network, both Al Qaeda and the Islamic State in East Africa. But here's what it says about Somalia. Again, quoting the report, quote, "In Somalia, the federal government continues to pursue its military offensive against al-Shabaab. Member states assess that despite suffering significant losses from targeted airstrikes and military operations, al-Shabaab remains resilient. Al-Shabaab's financial and operational capacity remains undiminished, with an estimated 7,000 to 12,000 fighters. Al-Shabaab continues to generate an estimated $100 million each year, mostly from its illicit taxation in Mogadishu in Somalia, $100 million. That's quite a bit. And then it continues. Thus far, al-Shabaab has absorbed most of the tax by the government. Member states assess that al-Shabaab has the upper hand in the next phase of the government's offensive." I'm going to just point out something quickly. Caleb, you made this in a conversation that they're saying they're suffering significant losses, and yet al-Shabaab has the upper hand in the next phase of the offensive.
Both things can't be true. Both things can't be true. They start out by saying that they've suffered significant setbacks, but yet we're still saying that they have the same amount of troop numbers that they've always said, 7,000 to 12,000, and we're also still saying that they're making $100 million a year. So if they're suffering significant losses, you would expect to see a reduction in those numbers, both from the financing and the troop number, but we're not. So I think it's quite clear, one, who that information is coming from, and two, really the resiliency that they state later of Shabab. I mean, they're right in that regard that Shabab has weathered this large counteroffensive against it. And in many cases, they've taken back some of the bases, some of the towns that they've lost, and others they've effectively been pushed out. But as you mentioned, another sort of theme of this podcast is the ebb and flow. Where they've lost in some areas, they've gained in others. But for all intents and purposes, they haven't been defeated. And the Somali government keeps putting these ridiculous dates on their defeat, which really only help nothing, of saying that, in 1 year we'll defeat them. Well, the year came and gone. So now it's by the end of 2024, we're going to defeat them. Yet, we're still early, I guess. So there's still time for Somalia to jump on that. But like, it's not looking good based on precedent. And especially when they still can't effectively start the phase 2 of the operation, which is supposed to be in Jubaland and sort of the southwest state, which borders Ethiopia. Those regional forces are doing operations, yes, but the phase 2 is supposed to be a giant surge of the federal forces, and that really hasn't came yet. From political infighting, from clan structures, it's just not happening. So all of the offensive is still in the center, where in some areas Shabab does have a more tenuous clan relationship. In others, they have very strong clan relationships. So it's just, again, ebb and flow. But as of right now, Shabab still has the upper hand. And let's not forget that the African Union forces, which provide a huge bolster for the local Somali forces, is leaving. They're still doing the drawdown. Their intention is still to leave by the end of, I think, this year or next year. And they're not changing that as of right now, as of the time of recording. So all Shabab has to do, which they've done during these gradual withdrawal phases, is wait. When the African Union force leaves a base and hands it over to the Somali National Army, they attack it. And most times they overrun it. So really, for Shabab, it's a waiting game right now. And I know the U.S. is scrambling to try to bolster the Somali army, as well as Turkey and some other states like UAE and Qatar. But without deploying the tens of thousands of troops that the African Union did, I don't see that helping the SNA, which is already sort of crumbling in some areas. And to be fair to the SNA and Somalia, they've done better in other areas. I don't want to disparage the entire counteroffensive, because some areas they have done very well and they've taken out some key leaders, but it's not enough, and it doesn't come fast enough, if that makes sense. They need continuous wins, but they're only getting sporadic wins. The question of holding, we're still in many cases relying on local clan militia to hold territory gained over Shabab. We still haven't figured that problem out of how is that going to work in the long run, and I think that's a big question everyone needs to ask. And I think just to move the conversation along, because we're getting long on time, just a few points for DRC and Mose. For DRC, the report seems to be spot on. With obviously my work at Bridgeway, or Bridgeway Foundation in general, deals with the ADF or ICE cap issue in DRC. That information seems to be largely correct. Whereas Mose, I think there's a few disagreements. I think, again, minor disagreements, but something that I do want to bring up. And some of these points are not wholly mine. These are also part of discussions from my coworker, Ryan O'Farrell. Ryan, who also works at Bridgeway with me, he closely follows Mozambique is certainly his sphere of influence or expertise. But some of the points they made about Mozambique appear to be either outdated or sort of not true. And this is just the process. I mean, these reports take months at a time, right? And then they're out. But the numbers that they state that ISMOS has appears to be low. When they attack, they sort of attack in 40 to 60 man groups, sometimes 100. And just based on attack patterns around northern Mozambique, there seems to be at least 4 to 6 of these groups. So if you do the math, it seems to be more than what the UN is saying. Then one little minor disagreement is that of Ibn Omar. Ibn Omar being the sort of former leader of ISMOs. He was killed last year. Big loss. Regardless of what I'm about to say, that's a big loss for IS Mozambique that really hampers their capabilities. He was a very influential leader. But his successor, Farido Arune, sort of already became the leader before Ibn Omar was killed. Farido has taken a more relaxed approach to civilians, whereas with Ibn Omar, who's a very, harsh against civilians, it's massacres. Whereas Farido is kind of taking directives allegedly from the Islamic State central leadership that you need to be more, nicer to the civilians, and that was sort of already happening before Ibn Omar was killed. Again, still a big loss that Ibn Omar is gone. And the one thing that the report doesn't mention, and this is just because of time and when this is happening and when this was written, is that IS Mos is sort of coming back from huge setbacks. I mean, there was the Rwandan intervention against them as well as the Southern African intervention against them. And this, again, gets back into the ebbs and flows of conflicts that we've talked about this entire podcast. Is the Southern African troops are leaving. Their mandate is over, so they'll be withdrawing soon. It's very unclear if the Rwandans can kind of step up and manage all of this on their own. And, IS Mozambique has already taken advantage of that, and they're surging in some of their districts, and especially in Macomia, where sort of their headquarters. And in the last several weeks, they've reoccupied villages, and they've reoccupied a city, and that's their first large territorial occupation since 2021, when the Rwandans drove them out of some of these towns. So they're already resurging, and it's not a good sign, especially with these Southern African troops leaving. And the Islamic State is having a heyday with this. I mean, they're making a big deal over these dawa or proselytizing campaigns that IS Mozambique is doing in these newly occupied areas. So it's not good. And I think Mozambique will probably become another big issue like it was in 2021. And then just the last point I want to make, I guess, for the entire podcast is they use this term that I absolutely hate, which is that there's no evidence of direct command and control. And I think that is a bullshit metric that really has no meaning. You're not going to see a leader in Iraq or Syria or Al-Qarar giving them day-to-day, hey, you need to attack this village, hey, you need to do this. It's more of these big centralized directives or strategies rather than these day-to-day, things that should be autonomous for the local regional leaders. Which, Bill, you make that point all the time of like DOD, is a 4-star general really going to be telling, a captain, here, and here every day? Not necessarily. So it's the same thing here. So this command and control is just another way to kind of move the goalposts for the actual relationship between IS Central and IS Mos, and it's just it does no good. And that's my probably big gripe with the report, is that one line.
We have to keep in mind, again, a lot of this is member states.
Member state. I definitely, it's definitely coming from a member state, probably, but it's just like that for IS Mos in Central Africa Province and DRC. That's the new buzzword. We've moved on from, they're not really the Islamic State, to how Islamic State are they? And it's just
decentralized.
And it's just moving the goalposts.
Loosely affiliated.
Should have been dead.
Right?
Yeah, this argument should have been dead years ago, but it keeps resurging, and it drives me crazy.
If you have to keep making these arguments, there's probably something wrong with them. Any input on East Africa?
Too much there for me to unpack. But some very interesting challenge. I mean, the one thing I would say about the command and control is, quoting from the report, regional member states maintain that there is no clear evidence of command and control orders. So, I mean, that is as clear as the monitoring team ever gets to saying we have got to include this in the report because we have been given this explicitly by more than one regional member state. We're not endorsing this analysis, but this is what we have been told. And that's part of the sort of the coding that exists within the report. You may well have half a dozen other member states who say there is command and control, but you have to make the point if it's been briefed to you by regional member states. But point taken on that. On Somalia, I guess a couple of points I wanted to add. I mean, I think Caleb talks about the ebb and flow. The ebb and flow is definitely a thing, and the fact that this is a snapshot of the past 6 months, and then you mentioned something that's happened in January. Well, yeah, that's right. Things are changing all the time, and there are things that are not captured by this report because it was drafted in December. And I don't think there is a contradiction between sustaining losses and being resilient. We used to say that about ISIL in Afghanistan. They were losing quite a lot of people being killed in engagements, but their numbers were growing. They were recruiting, I think in that respect, I don't think there is a contradiction there in the Somalia package. Clearly there is an intensification of conflict there, and Al-Shabaab will suffer some losses, but I agree, absolutely agree with Caleb that it remains resilient and extremely dangerous. And the long-term prognosis for Somalia strikes me as grim. And of course, this is not helped by this understanding being reached between Ethiopia and Somaliland, and sort of undermining the sort of the cohesiveness of Somalia. So I share Caleb's concerns, and I think Al-Shabaab is, I think you said, Bill, one of the most threatening, one of the most strongest and most dangerous branches or affiliates of Al-Qaeda. And I would just add the point that, there's been a lot of recent talk about humanitarian exemptions for sanctions. And the terrorist group that has been active in an area where there's been a humanitarian exemption for the longest period is Al-Shabaab. It's an interesting thing about the handling of Al-Shabaab by the Sanctions Committee in the UN is that even though Al-Shabaab is a self-proclaimed affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and it features very much in this report, in all of the monitoring team's reporting, the actual sanctions against Al-Shabaab figures are administered by the Somalia Committee, not by the Al-Qaeda Committee. And that has been a long-term grievance for the Kenyans, who said that sort of like they consider them to be slightly second-class sanctions. And, from Kenya's point of view, and I think Kenya is absolutely right about this, Al-Shabaab is one of the most dangerous international terrorist groups in the world. And so Kenya would say, well, why? Why is this being handled as a Somali sanctions issue and not as part of the Al-Qaeda sanctions? And part of that was because there was a long-term existing humanitarian carve-out. So, there was no jeopardy whatsoever for people engaged in humanitarian delivery if their humanitarian delivery was being diverted to Al-Shabaab. And that has often been trumpeted by the humanitarian community as being a great success of the Somalia sanctions regime. But I would point to what we've just been saying and agreeing, which is that Al-Shabaab is one of the most resilient, one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the world. And the prognosis for Somalia remains very bleak and very precarious. And Al-Shabaab has a very healthy income stream. And I would ask you, is it a coincidence that is the case where you have a humanitarian carve-out and whatever has to be paid to Al-Shabaab to facilitate humanitarian delivery, whatever they can extort from activity in the areas that they control, is that really nothing to do with the fact that they remain so well afloat on fat finances and so successful?
Yeah, we have to remember $100 million in Somalia is probably like, I don't know, $10 billion here in the United States. That's a lot of money to go around. And I agree with you on that, Edmund. The other point on Somalia I want to quickly make is I think the Somali government has received the maximum amount of support it's going to get from the United States, from the African Union. It's not going to get any better than it has. And that's what makes unless something changes, unless the U.S. turns around and decides to redevote resources, unless the African Union decides to not only keep troops there, but double down and add more troops and get them out on offensive missions. But that's not
bilateral agreements. There's been talks of, Burundi, Uganda, I think maybe Kenya, bilateral agreements with Somalia, but it still wouldn't be to the same 18,000 strong deployment that the AU was.
Yeah, who's paying for that? That's the thing. The African Union paying for that. The U.S. was providing money.
The U.S., yeah.
Providing money for that. So those things are possible, but I see the interest in Somalia, just like in Afghanistan, it's waned. The U.S. government wants to pivot to China, pivot to Russia, and here we are with basically war breaking out with the Middle East after Hamas's attack. And Somalia is how far down the list now? When we talk of just those three conflicts, I just don't see it happening. That's what gives me that grim prospect.
Just a quick point. Shabaab is increasingly a global group of, was it 2 or 3 years ago, there was, a pilot arrested in the Philippines for taking flight lessons. He was a Shabaab member. There was another one arrested a few months after that in an unnamed East African country, according to the New York Times, doing the same thing. in the last couple months, there's been 2 members of Shabab, including a son of a senior leader, arrested in Costa Rica. Like, who knows what they're doing there? So this is like increasingly growing more global, that only benefits Al Qaeda's overall operations, but yet kind of taking them second fiddle, as Edmund has pointed out, with these differing sanctions.
Edmund, any parting thoughts?
No, I mean, I'm very glad that Caleb, sort of revived the point about the pilot training. I mean, it's famous, isn't it, that the big terrorist spectaculars often seem to us to come out of the blue, but there are sort of threads that we then look at and think, well, then maybe we should have seen that coming. And, will the next big attack on civil aviation involve Al-Shabaab people who've done pilot training? I don't know. It's certainly something to be taken seriously. It's not enough to say, oh, this is a regional issue. If they've got a guy training as a civilian pilot in the Philippines, that tells you something about global ambition.
It sure does. Edmund, thanks for joining Caleb and I on today's episode of Generation Jihad. Always a pleasure to have you on. We will have you back on soon. We'll be talking about the Axis of Resistance project in more detail within the next couple of weeks.
And if I can just say on that, Bill, I think it's nice to think in terms of a connectivity between this podcast and the next, because the spider at the center of the web is Iran, isn't it? And we've already covered this very extensive Iranian featuring in the monitoring team report. Not necessarily explicitly in the monitoring team, but implicitly. And then when we move on to look at the Axis of Resistance, I think we'll find a lot of connective tissue.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.